And I had a lot of my Protestant friends who were pointing the fingers at the Catholics going, man, what a terrible church. Look at all that stuff that's going on. And I said, well, yeah, that is horrific, but quit pointing your finger at them, because I can tell you right now, it's no less prevalent here. We just haven't, it hasn't been exposed yet.
Doing this for over 50 years. And I was, at least to my knowledge, pretty much, the only female in the field. And I was told that the stories or the accusations of abuse were not true. And I was being a vulnerable, easy to fool female by believing them. Women are looking for attention, and you're getting sucked in.
When I'm clinging to your light, you will make the darkness bright.
The Christian church needs to convert to Christianity. The Christian church needs to, perhaps for the first time in centuries, take seriously everything Jesus said about children. And once we do that, everything else will fall into place. It's all about Jesus in the end.
Things like that. The difference over the decades is quite stunning. And I think for many of us in the field, it feels really slow, and it is. But the difference shows the impact that this hard work has done, and that our persistence in standing for victims and calling things by their right name, which is what our God does, has opened doors and called people to action and called them to be educated about abuse and what it does to other people.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today as we commemorate Grace's 20th anniversary. It seems hard to believe that 20 years ago, Boz, Diane, Matt, Phil, Emmanuel, and Victor and Jim all came together and met to determine to share this vision, to share what God had really laid on their hearts about equipping faith communities to do a better job of recognizing, preventing, and responding to abuse. But it's been 20 years. So thank you for joining us today as we commemorate that. There are a number of things that we're doing to commemorate the 20 years that we've been able to be working with the faith community on this issue. One of those is to come up with 20 flashes of light, 20 stories from survivors, from staff, from board members, from people who have shed light on abuse or misconduct within the church. And so you can find that on our website, and Zane will be posting a link to that soon in the chat as well. So please check out those 20 flashes of light. We also ask that today specifically, you would just set aside 20 minutes to pray for Grace, to pray for survivors, really to pray for everyone that is in this work of helping faith communities do a better job of recognizing, preventing, and responding to abuse, responding to misconduct. So if you could set aside 20 minutes, that would be great. There is a prayer guide that Grace has put out for the day. So if you could check that out, that would be wonderful. Zane will have the link in the chat. And there's a really great reflection on prayer by Lorianne Thompson that helps us just think of prayer, perhaps from the perspective of somebody who's been through abuse and has experienced that, and how that may impact their life of prayer. And then finally, we are really excited that we have received a matching gift donation. So this week, prior to October 19th, any donations you make up to $20,000 will be matched, will be doubled. So this is a great opportunity. If you've been thinking about giving to Grace, to give to Grace, your donation will be matched this week only. So that's through October 19th. So if you would head to our website or follow links that Zane posts in the chat, that would be wonderful just to have you donate. That, again, that donation will be doubled through October 19th. So now that we've gone through those first introductions, let's bring on our select panel that we have here. Those people that were in the room when it first happened. We have really a distinguished group of people with us today. I'm just going to go through and ask each person to give a brief introduction as they put their cameras back in action and take off the mute. If you could please just introduce yourselves and who you are briefly. Boz, do you want to get us started?
Sure. Thanks, Pete. Great to be here. I'm Boz Chividjian. So excited I was just telling the rest of the group before, I can't believe it's been 20 years. None of us look any older, but we all do look a lot wiser. That's at least my personal opinion. But I'm the founder of Grace, and I'll explain a little bit in a few minutes of how that happened. But currently I operate a law practice over the entirety of the country, where we represent survivors of sexual abuse against institutions who have failed to protect them. So it's a incredibly rewarding part of my work that I can continue to do in many ways in the same field as Grace, but utilizing my law degree to assist survivors reclaim their agency and find some degree of justice.
All right. Thanks, Boz.
Yeah.
Phil.
Yeah, I'm Phil Monroe. I'm a psychologist in the Philadelphia area. Work alongside Diane Langberg and have for many years. And first got to know this crew actually as a seminary professor, thinking about how we could train future pastors to better understand, identify, and respond to abuse in the Christian environment. And so I continue to do that work just from a private practice now.
Emmanuel.
Hello, I'm living in Norway right now, far away Norway. I've been privileged to be on the board of Grace at the beginning, and it's been an honor, and it's been very rewarding to me spiritually.
Matt.
Yeah, I started on the board with Boz. He told me about it in his office in DeLand, Florida, and I was completely on board. We've been friends since 2000 or earlier, when we both went to Stetson together. I currently serve as a chaplain in the Atlanta area for a hospice company.
Thank you. And Diane.
Diane Langberg. I am a psychologist who has worked with trauma and abuse of many kinds for over 50 years. And I'm actually sitting in the office, which is my office, where this group gathered and said, let's do this. So 50 some years later, here we are, whatever it was. Anyway, added to my work to see people really want to get the church to understand and to help victims in those situations, which are not safe places to be. So it's been a real honor.
Wow. Well, thank you, Diane, and thank you to really all of you for joining us today. And thank you for being sensitive to God's leading for that meeting 20 years ago when you all gathered and first laid the groundwork for what would become Grace as an organization. So thank you very much. Well, why don't we get started in our conversation today? And we'll start with Boz. Boz, what motivated you to start Grace? What kind of got the ball rolling and got this whole thing happening?
Yeah, thanks, Pete. Before I answer that, I do want to really encourage everybody. This fundraising goal is really pretty amazing. I mean, the fact that we have somebody who's willing to match whatever you give for this week is significant. That doesn't happen every day. And so, you know what? You give $5, you're really giving 10. You give $100, you're really giving 200. I'm not very good with math, so I'm keeping the low numbers, but I just want to encourage everybody to think about that. If there's a time to give to grace, or if you know somebody who you think might be a great donor to grace, this is the week to do it, because you're doubling whatever is given, which is really unique. To answer your question, Pete, you know, my background was as a grew up in a Christian family. Church was not a traumatic experience for me at all. Generally, I grew up believing church and the faith community was a fairly safe community. And then I became a prosecutor in Central Florida in 1994, and it didn't take long for me to begin to see the prevalence of child sexual abuse in this community and throughout Central Florida. And then as I began to read throughout the world. And one of the things that struck me, Pete, was how many of my cases, and I prosecuted and supervised over thousands of cases during that tenure, how many of them were connected or associated in some way with a faith community, whether the abuser was within the church, whether the abuser was outside the church, but the family brought the matter to the pastor's attention, and the pastor just profoundly failed in how he or she responded. There was just some connection. And I remember as I left the prosecutor's office and went into private practice thinking, man, that's not the church that I understood existed when I was a kid. And around that same period of time, we also have the stuff going on being exposed up in Boston with the Catholic Church. And I had a lot of my Protestant friends who were pointing the fingers at the Catholics going, man, what a terrible church. Look at all that stuff that's going on. And I said, well, yeah, that is horrific, but quit pointing your finger at them, because I can tell you right now, it's no less prevalent here. It hasn't been exposed yet. And so that really weighed heavy on me. And I just thought, man, I always understood the church to be a place, or should be a place, of refuge, not a source of trauma. And so as I began to think through it and pray through it, I realized maybe there's something that I can do with all that I've learned on the front lines of prosecuting, that I can in some way, shape, or form help equip and educate the faith community on this issue. And I'd been friends with Victor Veith for a few years, and I shared that idea with him. Victor loved it. Victor connected me with Jim Luttrell. Diane, we connected with you not long after that. Victor's wife, Lisa, she gets the credit for naming Grace, Godly Response to Abuse in a Christian Environment. As soon as she said that, we're like, we got the name. At least the hardest part's over with. And, you know, then I called Emmanuel, because I always said, well, if you start an organization, you should always have one family member on there. So I said, hey, Emmanuel, you want to join Grace? And I'm not sure if he knew exactly what he was getting into. But like he said, it's been in so many ways so profound for all of us. And so that ultimately resulted in us being in Diane's very office, which is pretty cool to see, in the summer of 2004, as we were talking earlier, as that summer we had 3 hurricanes come through Central Florida. One of them during that same weekend, we were all up in Philadelphia, and we were at a Phillies game, and I'm talking to my wife, who's with some friends trying to protect themselves from the hurricane. I was a little bit of guilt, but it just, that's what started. And all I'll say is, and I'll be quiet, is this group here and the subsequent heroes that God has brought on board in leadership in this organization, in so many ways, has been my church for the past 20 years. This is a group of people who reminds me that not all Christians are crazy. We all are a little bit crazy, but they just bring back some grounding for me, have always brought me back grounding. And when you do this type of work, you have to have that. Otherwise, you become incredibly cynical, self-destructive, and can ultimately be a toxic person. And this amazing group of heroes have protected me from that. And I'm incredibly and eternally grateful for each one.
Wow, that's great. Thank you for sharing that, Boz. And so they met, and some of them heard directly from Boz, some of them heard from Victor, but they all gathered together. A couple of the people, Jim and Victor, are not able to be with us today, and they have some reflections to share with us by video. One of those first reflections is going to be by Jim, and he's going to share how he first heard about grace.
Billy Graham. So I was so impressed with Boz, with his passion, with his humor, with his personableness, but with his clear and unambiguous belief that the church was really falling short and that we needed to protect the vulnerable ones in our congregations, particularly children, but not only children, and to protect them from those who would exploit them and use their power against them, and whether it's for sexual abuse or some other kind of manipulation and control. So I was very impressed in meeting Boz, and grateful to Victor for that introduction. And then a couple of years later, I heard from Victor that Boz had formed Grace, and that a board was being put together, and would I consider joining that board. And it was, as I had said to someone recently, you know, there are tiers of incredible days or incredible experiences in one's life. And the first tier is pretty much reserved for pivotal spiritual and family moments. But the very top of that second tier in my life was the invitation to join the Grace team. And even though at the time I never thought that I would play a staff role at Grace, I don't think Boz ever thought that Grace would end up with an investigatory function and role within churches. But it was just this trust that we had gathered together a group of people who had both knowledge about sexual abuse and other forms of spiritual abuse, knowledge about the church, a great burden that our primary focus being the conservative Protestant church, that we realize we have at least as many problems in this area as the Catholic Church was dealing with very much in the news at that time. And we had a role to play. God had a mission for us, and that was just really exciting. So to meet just some amazing people. I would like to start name dropping, but I'll leave somebody out that played a very important role, and I don't want to do that. But just meeting some of the most incredible people in those early days who were supportive, and many of them joining the board of Grace.
And that was from Jim, one of those people that were in the room where it happened back 20 years ago. Another person who was in that room was Emmanuel. Emmanuel, can you share with us some of your insights? What were some of those initial challenges that were faced as Grace was first getting off the ground? Some of the initial challenges that you encountered and had to deal with?
Well, when Boz told me about Grace and said, "Would you join the board?" I loved Boz. I trusted him. I said, "Sure, why not?" It seems like it's a good, positive role. I was working at the time for a large PR firm, and I was the ethics officer there. I thought maybe I can bring some of those practices to the organization, but I had no idea. I had no idea of the magnitude of the problem. I had no idea of the spirit of grace. And I've been reflecting tonight, that spirit has stayed on for 20 years. Somehow Boz was able to convey that spirit of caring for the widow and the orphan, those in distress. And when I think about it now, I'm not sure I would still be a Christian if it wasn't for grace.
Wow.
A strong statement.
Wow.
So, and this has, for these 20 years, has been an amazing, amazing experience. I've been re-inspired at every board meeting by the dedication, the professionalism, but most important, by the Spirit.
Wow. Thank you, Emmanuel. That was really moving. Yeah, for so many of us, it really has helped secure our faith as we've seen not just God working, but God's people working in some incredible ways to care for those who've been abused, who've been mistreated, who've known harm at the hands of those claiming the name of Christ, but not doing such a good job of reflecting Christ. So Grace got started. The board was pulled together. Matt, what was it like in those early years being on the board at Grace?
Well, like I said, I've known Boz since college, and his friendship to me has been incredible. It's been such a privilege to be walking along life with him, and he helped me in so many ways get through multiple storms. Not the least of which is just coming to faith in the first place. So his relationship to me was what drew me in. I knew nothing really about the abuse, as Boz echoed. That I came up in a family where I didn't have anything along the lines. Didn't really know anybody who had come through the kind of trauma that we were exposed to when we started talking about these subjects. I came up in a big church, that's been mentioned already. And so there were a lot of scandals around that, and that kind of disgusted me when I heard about it. And then the exposure I had in the church that I was involved with, again, there was nothing going on. So all of this was new to me. So it was surreal to be in the room, to understand the depth of the trauma that some of the people have gone through. But to know that there were people like the people you see here on screen, and Victor and Jim, who were with us, and Clarissa, all of them having the knowledge and experience to deal with it and not being afraid to deal with it, gave me confidence in where the kingdom of God is going, in terms of how to deal with trauma like this. And so it was a real privilege, and still is, to be affiliated with Grace, even though I'm not on the board anymore. I think it really helped draw me in the direction that I'm in now. I went to seminary after I started on the board, and really took me from what I thought was a one direction into something vocationally, where I'm now serving other people, not in the capacity of trauma, but when I hear it, I've got a lot more wisdom and experience to help people navigate it, whether that's in the hospital chaplaincy or in the hospice chaplaincy. So it was a gift. It was a gift that keeps on giving.
All right. Thank you, Matt. Thank you. So one of the things that you all have mentioned so far is you've mentioned a lot about people who are survivors, people who have experienced abuse within churches or other faith communities. Phil, can you help us understand, what is it like? What are some unique challenges that survivors of abuse in faith settings might face compared to those in other contexts? And what are and how has the work of organizations like Grace shed work on those challenges?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's really true that people who are harmed in faith communities end up having two kinds of wounds. There's the original wound of the harm that they experience, and then there is actually the more significant wound that happens when their community or the leaders in that community tell them that that wound doesn't exist, that it didn't happen to them, that they should be quiet, that they're the cause of it. I might point out that Ken Pargament, a psychologist, researcher, understanding mental health and trauma, says that people get better faster where they're in safe communities that can hear their pain, acknowledge what happened, and help them lament and heal. And he's researching across faith communities, not just in one kind, not just Protestant or even Christian. And unfortunately, what we've seen so often is that survivors have often had to bear this wound by themselves. They're not in a safe community that allows their wounds to be acknowledged even or discussed. If anything, they are vilified for having them. Unfortunately, we still see that even over this weekend. You might have been on places and seeing people who are talking about wanting to not hold on to the spirit of bitterness or something like this as one of these wounds. So when grace came along, it was so helpful for so many people to hear that somebody was talking about their wounds. And like what Emmanuel is saying is, for many people, it's what helped them hang on to their faith. Oh, it is possible to talk about this in a way that understands what I've gone through without making me the enemy.
Wow. Thanks, Phil. Yeah, that's great. So Grace got started. These people all came together in recognition of the special needs that are there, the unique circumstances that are there when this has occurred to a person within a faith context. And then they started talking to churches. They started bringing this issue forward. Diane, what was that like? How did faith communities react? How did they respond when you first started talking to them? Were they open? Were they accepting of what you were saying? Or were they a little bit more, no, not here?
The latter. You're talking about, number one, discussing a terrible thing that has happened in churches, and people don't want to face that. And you're talking about somebody like me speaking about that, and I was the wrong gender to speak about anything in a lot of churches that many years ago. And so not only was there this female wandering around, she was talking about things that aren't true. That was basically the response. I was pretty much I've been doing this for over 50 years. And I was, at least to my knowledge, pretty much, the only female in the field. And I was told that the stories or the accusations of abuse were not true. And I was being a vulnerable, easy to fool female by believing them. Women are looking for attention, and you're getting sucked in. And I was following Freud. The church followed Freud in the sense that they said women sometimes tell these stories, and your job is not to get hooked by them. If I believe them, I will be contributing to their problems and to their wounds and everything else, because it's simply not true. It doesn't happen in our churches. So when I think about the relationship I have now with churches and speaking in Christian organizations and denominations and things like that, the difference over the decades is quite stunning. And I think for many of us in the field, it feels really slow, and it is. But the difference shows the impact that this hard work has done, and that our persistence in standing for victims and calling things by their right name, which is what our God does, has opened doors and called people to action and called them to be educated about abuse and what it does to other people.
Wow. It is encouraging to see the change that has happened. It is discouraging to see it coming so slowly.
Yes, slow, and there's still great resistance. That's not gone away. It isn't 100% anymore, but it's still there and very strong.
That's
not
for
our
sure.
church, not our organization.
Yeah. So Grace started talking to churches, and along the way they came into some various situations that they were speaking into. Victor has a memory of a specific situation that he dealt with. So Zane, if you could play the video of Victor talking, that would be great.
Yeah, as part of the team that investigated the issues of abuse in New Tribes Mission and did some other work on a handful of investigations over the years. And the thing that stands out to me, not just from the investigations, but from the overall work of Grace, is that for many, many survivors, as well as people in the child protection community who happen to be Christians, Grace has become their church. And the reason for that is most offenders incorporate theology into the abuse of children. And when abuse becomes known in the institution often hides behind a twisted, toxic theology to keep things quiet. And as a result, many survivors have felt that they need, just for their own sake, and oftentimes the sake of their own soul, to flee the faith community. And so I have had so many survivors over the years express to me in one way or another that Grace is their church, Grace is the lifeline, Grace is the connection to their Christian faith, because Grace reminded them that Jesus was on the side of children. Jesus said, "What's done in the dark should be brought to light." Jesus said, "Better a millstone around your neck, tossed in the sea, than to hurt a child." Jesus said, be careful what you do to children, because their angels have direct access to their heavenly Father. The least of these will determine the destiny of our souls on Judgment Day. Those who preached a good game and puffed themselves up and, oh, I grew this mega church, but they didn't care for the least of these, will be shocked that Jesus sends them away. And those who were humble and were kind and cared for the children and other vulnerable persons, those are the true Christians. Those are the true followers of Christ. These are shocking things that Jesus said. And for many survivors of abuse, Grace has helped them reclaim Jesus, has reconnected them to the old stories of Jesus and the children.
It's so important for us to see just the centrality of this message for Jesus and for us today as Christians. We have to remember that. We have to keep that at the forefront, that this was a priority for Jesus. Diane talked a little bit about what she has seen as far as a shift over the last 20 years. Jim is going to share with us a little bit more about some of the shift that he has seen as well over the last 20 years. So Zane, if you could go ahead and start Jim's video, that would be great.
A recognition that the world was watching. How do we care for one another within the church? You know, I'm up in years. I'm plenty old enough to know one of the popular worship songs of the early and mid 70s was "They Will Know We Are Christians by Our Love." And I had many conversations, both as a board member at Grace and as a director of institutional response, with pastors, seeing them recognize that our community knows we have abuse within our church. The community is watching to see how our church is going to respond. And so a whole different shift I have noticed, and I can't say how pervasive it is, but a different shift in many churches over reputation and how that's defined. Not a loss of concern for what our reputation is in our community, but a different measuring stick. And I think the measuring stick was, we want to be known as the church who responds faithfully and compassionately to those who have been abused within our church or have disclosed abuse to us, and that we are faithful to those vulnerable people, to those survivors of abuse. And that's our first calling. That's our first objective. And I don't think 25 years ago, 15 years ago, that was as strong an impulse as it is today. It could be stronger, and there are places where we lag behind, but I have seen pastors, church leaders really take to heart what kind of reputation do we want to have within our community? And we don't want to have the reputation where we cover up and where we protect ourselves, but where we are vulnerable, where we are free to lament and to say we're sorry and to weep with those who weep. And that's the kind of heart we want to have as a church. So that's one change that I think I noticed shortly before I joined the staff at Grace, and then through the time I was there, that more and more churches desiring that level of reputation, which I think was a real positive sign.
So Jim and Diane have talked about just this cultural shift. By no means is it adequate, what we've seen so far. We see movement. It's not enough, but there has been some movement, and that's wonderful to see. And that really lays the foundation then for looking to the future. So as we look to the future, Victor is going to share some emerging issues and trends that he believes Grace will have to deal with going forward. Zane, did you want to play the video of Victor? Thanks.
Carvo, who once said it's the economy stupid. In this area, it's the theology stupid. Increasingly, we have seen that the most important reform, if Christianity is ever going to get this right, is to reform theologically. Why is it that we have either no child protection policies, or if we do, they're pretty weak policies and they're focused only on protecting kids from sexual abuse within the church? Well, that's because lawyers and insurance companies have reminded us those are the kids who are most likely to one day sue us. So those kids we have to try to protect from abuse. But the church isn't all that concerned about sexual abuse in the home, which is greater in terms of its numbers. They're not concerned about physical abuse. They're not concerned about emotional abuse. They're not concerned about neglect. They're not concerned about child torture. And they're not concerned about kids exposed to interpersonal violence. That is not of a concern because those kids don't ever hold a press conference. They don't ever sue us. That's sinful. That's wrong. We're not going to change that until the church converts to Christianity and once again takes Jesus seriously and says, wait a minute. This was like at the epicenter, the heart of Jesus's teaching. He put a child in the midst of the crowd and said, whoever welcomes this child in my name is not only welcoming me, but welcoming God. This is the determining issue in the church, Jesus said. This was radical and today's standards off the chart radical when Jesus uttered these words. We need to reclaim that. We need to harness a growing child theology movement that says there's a lot in the teachings of Jesus about children. There's a lot that Jesus said that is very applicable to child abuse, and we need to begin to write about it, talk about it. We need to implement seminary courses. Only 3% of accredited seminaries in the United States, according to one analysis, has any education on child abuse, much less the sort of intense education that is necessary. And it's not just about protecting children from abuse, which I think would happen if we reform theologically. It's also ministering to the lost sheep. We know that religion is used in a toxic way to abuse children, but we also know from research that good theology, replacing toxic theology, can be extraordinarily comforting spiritually. And if we help a survivor heal spiritually, they do a better job in terms of their medical and mental health. So it's theology. That is where seminaries need to go. That's where Grace needs to go. We need to reclaim Jesus, and as I said earlier, talk about those old stories of Jesus and the children.
Wow, what a profound statement. Until the church converts to Christianity. Yeah, we need to focus on the words of Christ when it comes to caring for children, caring for those who may be vulnerable. So with an eye to the future, Boz, what can individuals and organizations do to continue to support and advance the work of Grace or other organizations that are at work in this area? What can we do?
Well, I can say as an attorney who's out there in the field, I think we have seen a shift in many ways in the church, but I can also tell you that abuse is, in my opinion, at epidemic proportions. And it's not just the abuse of children. I think that maybe in some ways the church in not all pockets has sort of got the message that, you know, the abuse of children is not good. And even some of the churches that 20 years ago would not have been willing to listen to us about that topic are a little bit more open to hearing, but that's where it ends. The epidemic of adult clergy abuse is unbelievable to me. I get more calls every week on adult clergy abuse, adults who have been targeted, groomed, and abused by clergy. It's out of control. The changing nature of the church. One of the things we haven't talked about here is the fact that, I mean, in 2024, the look of the church today doesn't look anything like it did 20 years ago. People are fleeing the church. And when I mean the church, I mean the denominational, buildings, the services, the non-denominational church. People are getting out because they see that so much of it is rotten at the core. And this generation just doesn't have the patience for that. And so the question then becomes, the changing nature of the church, but the reality is the value and worth of humanity doesn't change. So how, as we as an organization, how do we continue to effectuate that cultural shift in a world where the church and the look of the church is changing perhaps more than it's ever had in my lifetime, where the membership of churches are dwindling, the number of people actually going to church is dwindling, because if we're just going to be focusing on them, we're missing a growing segment of people who would like to be in some form of community, but who have fled for very good reasons. And so that's where I come back to with regard to Grace. I mean, one of my regrets in 20 years is that there has not been more organizations that have sprouted up that I would say qualify as having the same expertise, multidisciplinary approach, and experience as Grace. And of course, I'm a little biased, but Grace is still the standard bearer of this. When people are looking to do independent investigations, Grace gets it. Not only do they know how to investigate, but they understand the theological component that is so integral to so much of this abuse. And they talk about it and they expose it. We also know how to understand and welcome survivors to meet with our investigators in a safe environment, in an affirming environment. And that's why so many institutions are a little bit weary of even asking Grace to come in, because they know we're going to call it like we see it. And in a world where institutions are still primarily focused on protecting themselves and not really focused on genuine cultural change, they will go to some of these others that are out there who might give them what they want, who will talk about this one bad pastor. He was terrible, but now he's gone. It's back to status quo, without asking the question, but wait a minute. How did this pastor become this pastor? How did this church become so unhealthy and toxic? It's not just one bad egg. And so I still tell people daily, if you're looking for true, genuine, authentic cultural change, Grace is it. And you're going to have times where you're not going to hear things that you're going to hear things you don't want to hear, but that's part of growth and coming to terms with truth. And Grace continues to grow. And it's not a growth that we all want, just an organization growing. That means nothing. The reason it grows is because there's still a profound need for the work we do. And so as we look forward and move forward, I think Grace also has to adopt to the changing nature of what the church looks like compared to what it did 20 years ago. And I think it is. And I think for that reason, it's the work we do is no less important today than it was when we started 20 years ago.
Wow. The church truly does look different than it once did. Grace really works hard to try and seek justice, to try and seek healing for those who have experienced abuse and those who have experienced misconduct. But we can't obtain that for everybody. Diane, what message would you like to convey to survivors of abuse who are still seeking justice, who are still seeking healing?
Well, I would tell them to tell their story, to turn on the lights. I had a grandmother who lived in the mountains of West Virginia, and I've often told this story as an illustration. And I stayed with her for a few days. I must have been 8 years old or something. And she asked me to go in the cellar, and it was a true cellar, let me tell you, and get the laundry. And I went down there and came flying up the stairs to the kitchen, crying, saying, I can't go down there because there are rats everywhere. And my grandmother took me by the hand and took me to the stairs, and she turned on a big light. She said, honey, when you turn the light on, the rats always run. And I think that's a message to the church. We have failed in many ways to turn the light on. That's what grace is about, turning the light on. When it happens, the rats run. But that's an uncomfortable, frightening, now what do I do situation. And we want things smooth and the way we're used to. But I would encourage you to be truth speakers. It's a costly thing to do. Ask Jesus. Courageous victims, and I've known many, speak truth. Where we are today is in large measure due to your bravery, your words, and it has been a very hard road and often costly for most of you, if not all of you. And it's also been very lonely as well. But you are valued. You are honored by this group for your courage and your words in spite of the response. And we will continue to honor and encourage you and speak up for you and with you at the same time.
Wow. A very important message. Thank you, Diane. So we have a path forward that's coming. And we need to look at that as we continue to seek to try and obtain justice, try and facilitate healing for those who have known abuse and experienced misconduct. Emmanuel, how can Grace and other organizations better support survivors in their journey toward healing?
I think that a survivor will feel if you really care.
Mm.
They will know if you care about them and not about theology that is misinterpreted. I had the experience the other day inviting someone from a church to come to a meeting that we've organized here about abuse. And at first she said, I won't be coming. And I said, you're busy. She said, yes. And then I think she felt enough to say, it will be too difficult for me. The topic is too difficult. So, we live in a small town, and this is a church person going. So it's there, but people don't know. But if they feel you really care, I think that's the answer.
Wow. Really caring, genuinely caring, to not be dragged into it, but to willingly enter into these conversations, to willingly enter into this role that I think Christ has called us all to, and that is to be there as someone who loves and cares for those who've been harmed in some way. Well, thank you all so very much for joining us for this conversation today. Just in closing, I'm wondering if each of you, Boz and Diane and Matt and Emmanuel, Phil had to leave for an appointment. If you could just take a minute or two to reflect on what is one thing that you hope changes and how faith communities understand or address this issue in the next 20 years. So we've looked back on the past 20 years. What do you see in the next 20 years? One thing that you hope changes in how faith communities understand and address this issue. Boz, did you want to start? You're muted.
One thing that's difficult. I guess it all boils down to, goes back to a little bit what Victor says. My hope and prayer for the church is that it will re-encounter the Jesus who lived on this earth and who is the Son of God. I think we, by and large, and this is not everybody, but I think we have, by and large, forgotten who he is. I think we've forgotten what he looks like. I think we have forgotten how he acts. think in large part we have forgotten his love. If the church is reintroduced to Jesus, then it will become the community where survivors flee towards and not away from. It will become the community of refuge and not the community where so much trauma has been inflicted. It will become the community of hope. And so how we do that is a mystery to me, to be honest with you. But the Jesus I grew up to know and love, and who still is the only reason why I still claim to be a Christian today, is what I long for the church to be reintroduced to, because that Jesus was the greatest friend of children and of the rest of those who get overlooked by society. He ran towards them and didn't walk by. And that's what the church has to go back to doing, because we've largely lost sight of that, because it's all about power and influence, and that's not the gospel.
Very true. Very true. Matt, what are some of your thoughts?
Well, following up with what Boz said, when Jesus was dying on the cross, he had two men on either side of him, probably both victims of abuse because of their crimes, what they did. And one of them humbly communicated that he, remember me, and I think that's what we have to do, is enable people to continue to communicate, and following up with what Diane said on the light, giving them this opportunity. I think that as grace is something I support financially. It's something that I think is important for the future of the church, and for the future of one or thousands of victims that will come forth, because there's a place where they can communicate safely, and they know they're loved, and they know that we are here to support them and to give them that space.
Right. Diane, what are your thoughts?
Mine are in many ways echoing what's been said, but that preserving the system will not be primary to us. It is ruled. And we have been called by our God to feed and protect his sheep, not our systems. The question, I think, for the church today is, do we really, truly love Jesus Christ? And do we truly seek to be like him? Because if those things are true, then we will feed and protect his sheep as he did, no matter what happens to the system.
Wow. People over the system. Wow. Profound. Emmanuel, what are your thoughts?
My thoughts are hope. And the hope, what Diane mentioned, is that more and more survivors have the courage to speak, because as they speak, it gives courage to others that haven't spoken yet. And that we will witness a shift. We're beginning to witness a shift with the Me Too movement, but I'd like to see a shift in the church where it's no longer acceptable, where people come out and denounce it. And I think it's happening, and I think we're playing a role in it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Victor and Jim also have recorded some of their last thoughts on one thing that they hope changes in how the faith community understands and addresses this issue in the next 20 years. So Zane, did you want to go ahead and play the video of Victor and of Jim?
About churches, a growing recognition of our need to be known as a church whose first impulse is to protect the weak and the vulnerable, and not to protect an abuser, despite their clout in the church and in the community, despite their influence. I would love to see that become become the standard, become the rule, and not a growing exception. The other thing I would like to see happen is a boldness. I was thinking about just the early days of Grace and the name that was selected for Grace, godly response to abuse in the Christian environment. That's a bold, audacious thing to claim, that we're going to be a godly response. It's an awesome responsibility. I felt that as a board member, and even more so as a staff member. I'm putting myself out there as being a godly response. God help me not to fail. And I guess I would wish for more organizations, more institutions, more churches to seize upon that boldness that Boz did in the early days, and with those who were part of the founding of Grace, to accept that boldness. This is going to be a godly response. We're not saying that without some trepidation. We're not saying that without some fear and trembling, but we are going to be faithful in this area. And I guess a stronger commitment that this protection of those who are weak and vulnerable, building a culture that outs any attempt to be exploitive or manipulative or to use power wrongly, that there be boldness in confronting that, and not a timidity, and not a shyness.
I said it in a longer answer, but the short answer is the Christian church needs to convert to Christianity. The Christian church needs to, perhaps for the first time in centuries, take seriously everything Jesus said about children. And once we do that, everything else will fall into place. It's all about Jesus in the end.
Some very profound wisdom shared with us, and really great just reflecting back on the past 20 years and what that has held, and some thoughts on what the next 20 might hold. So thank you for joining us today. We've had a wonderful panel discussion. Thank you for joining us today and listening as well. And thank you to everyone who raises their voice and brings attention to this issue, that will not be silent, that will shed light on abuse and misconduct in the church. Thank you for joining us today. Again, please, if you haven't had a chance yet to check out those 20 flashes of light, please check out the 20 flashes of light that you can find on our webpage, and Zane had posted a link for that. Please also remember that today is a day of prayer. So setting aside 20 minutes today to pray for Grace, to pray for survivors, to pray for all in this work. And then finally, please remember that this week and this week only, there is a matching gift of up to $20,000. So if you are considering the possibility of a gift to Grace, doing it this week before October 19th would be absolutely incredible, because then you could tie into that match and event and in essence, double the impact of your gift. Thank you again for joining us, everyone, and have a great rest of your day. Bye now.